It truly felt to me that my options were suicide or to drink ayahuasca and try to let it help me. Hey, so today will be my very first story time video. I'm going to speak about how I was called to do ayahuasca. In short, I was at a place with my mental health where I reached a complete breaking point. I was completely desperate for relief from severe anxiety and depression, and after years of therapy and being put on a ton of pharmaceutical medication that was just not helping, if anything, made things worse, I just got to a place with my mental health where I felt like I really had no other options. I want to preface my story by saying that I have had a history of anxiety and depression since I was really young. I had really bad separation anxiety disorder when I was about 6-7 years old, which then went into generalized anxiety disorder in high school, mixed with depression. So mental health struggles have always been a part of my life. I have what I would say a pretty extensive history with pharmaceutical medication and talk therapy, but again, after not very much success with those two things, I found psychedelics. I got to a place where I became actively suicidal, and I was quite literally desperate for any dramatic treatment or experience I could have to quickly and significantly ease my suicidal thoughts and depression. So years ago, I somehow heard of ayahuasca. I don't remember how I first heard of ayahuasca. I used to love watching documentaries and learning about different things, and I've always been super into learning about healing modalities, especially for mental health, since that's my passion. Then I had a period of time where I got really into watching Chelsea Handler. I love her. I think she's great. And I remember once I watched one of her Netflix specials where she and two of her friends traveled to Peru to do ayahuasca, and that just really drilled into me that one day I'd like to do ayahuasca. I had no intentions on when I would do it or where, but it just fascinated me, and I felt really drawn to the concept of ayahuasca. I then did more research on my own, and I got kind of hyper fixated on learning about ayahuasca for a short period of time. So I knew it existed, but I didn't know anyone personally who was into the psychedelic plant medicine world. So ayahuasca was in the very back of my mind for years as an idea, but I never seriously considered it or had plans to do it. Okay, so that being said, let's jump into August 2020. The pandemic was just winding down. During the pandemic, I was in Costa Rica, and then once COVID regulations started lifting, I made the decision to move to New York City. It was always a dream of mine to live in Manhattan ever since I was in high school, and I was 24 years old, so I just finally felt ready and determined to move to the city. So I ended up moving to Gramercy Park. Now, keep in mind, the pandemic was just ending and there was still a lot of COVID regulations in New York. And to be honest, looking back, it was absolutely the worst time to move to New York. COVID was still everywhere. There was so many regulations with the restaurants and the stores. It definitely wasn't the fun New York that I would visit in high school and what I had in mind when I thought about living there. But I was just determined to move there anyways. So I moved into an apartment in Gramercy Park and I got a job, and very quickly my mental health started to decline. I think it was a combination of a lot of things. I've struggled with anxiety since I was very, very young. I had separation anxiety as a kid, and I've always been the type of person where if I get really overwhelmed, I just get hit with a ton of anxiety and I start feeling super anxious. So I think moving to New York was a big life change. Plus the fact that it was still COVID, that alone was overwhelming. New York is a very expensive place to live, and I quickly just started worrying about money and paying rent. I ended up not liking the job that I had. I was barely making any money. I didn't feel fulfilled at all. I wasn't on any sort of career path, and I just felt like I was wasting my potential and I wasn't on the right path in my life. I pretty much felt like I really didn't have much of a purpose or any purpose in my life. Then on top of all of this, I was in a long distance relationship with my ex. So there was just a lot of life changes and stressors going on, and I could feel my central nervous system getting more and more imbalanced and out of whack due to the amount of stress and anxiety, and it was just building and building and building up. So I already wasn't feeling very good. I wasn't happy in my life, and my anxiety was just starting to gain momentum. As I have already said, I've had anxiety and depression the vast majority of my life. So what I was experiencing wasn't entirely unusual. So not that many alarms went off in my head where I thought I really needed to do anything about it. I kind of just thought that it was typical me, typical McKenna, getting anxious and overwhelmed as per usual. Then fast forward a few weeks, it's October 2020. At the time, my boyfriend and I were dating for 2 years, and I was very, very much in love with him. I trusted him fully. He was my best friend, and although I chose to live in New York and he lived in another state, I was still in the relationship, like emotionally invested in the relationship. He ended up breaking up with me, and I was pretty blindsided. I really didn't see it coming, and this was the final thing that completely pushed me over the edge. It was like the straw that broke my mental health. I went from having moderate to tolerable anxiety to pretty much having what I would consider a nervous breakdown. I feel embarrassed or kind of ashamed admitting that being broken up with fully triggered me into a deep depression and severe episode of anxiety. But after working more in therapy and doing plant medicine the last 18 months or so, it's super obvious now looking back why I had this intense psychological reaction. I have a fear of abandonment. I have had traumatic childhood events which have led me to this fear of abandonment embedded in my psyche, specifically a pretty severe birth trauma that I believe really initiated the abandonment issues. And although I kind of knew this subconsciously for years, it wasn't until this incident that I came to the full realization of how much this fear of abandonment affects my relationships, both romantic and platonic relationships in my life. And while it's hard for me to be vulnerable and go on YouTube and admit this is an issue I've had to work through, I genuinely feel that part of my purpose on this earth is to help others with anxiety and depression. So if the story helps someone or eases the stigma of having an abandonment fear or trauma, then to me, it's worth it. I'm not going to go into how childhood trauma can significantly impact us in adulthood because that is an entirely different conversation. But now I know I have this abandonment trauma, wound, fear, whatever you may want to call it. I believe my brain literally interpreted this breakup as an abandonment, which then forced my body into fight or flight mode. And my trauma response to this was to literally freeze up. Like, I reacted with the freeze response to the situation. And if you didn't already know, the freeze response is quite literally what depression is. So my brain got triggered into pretty much reliving a past traumatic event, and the only way my body knew how to respond was to emotionally and psychologically shut down, hence the depression. No one really talks about how depression is literally a trauma response, but that's not the purpose of this video, so let's just get right back to where we left off with the story. So I went from moderate anxiety to full-fledged I can't function anxiety. Over a period of a few weeks, I started having anxiety attacks. I went to work one day and had to just leave, because I was just having crippling anxiety to the point where I was shaking, crying. I could barely leave my apartment because my anxiety got so bad. Now, while this happened in November of 2020, I look back at this time in my life and barely remember it at all. The entire month is just wiped from my memory. I remember the end of October, and then the next thing I remember is mid-December. So I just think my body went into full fight or flight mode, and I guess it resulted from memory loss. I know that's not completely unheard of. By December, I ended up having to call my psychiatrist, asking her for an emergency medication to subdue the severe anxiety. My roommate at the time had to go to the pharmacy for me to pick up my Klonopin prescription, and for literally 3 days, I popped Klonopin like it was Tic Tacs or candy, so I could function enough to pack up all my belongings, move out of my apartment, and get myself on a plane to Colorado, to where my parents were renting a house at the time. So somehow I was able to move out of my New York apartment in 3 days and get myself on a flight to Colorado. And once I got to Colorado and settled in, I think my nervous system was able to relax enough to know I didn't have to worry about rent or work or all the stressors of being independent and living alone. So while I was still having severe anxiety, it was now coupled with severe depression. From mid-December through February, I was severely depressed. Worst depressive episode of my life. I've experienced depression before, but this was a lot worse than I've ever experienced. I stopped taking care of myself. I stopped showering. I stopped brushing my teeth, eating. I would just sleep for hours and hours and lie in bed. I would wake up every single morning with severe anxiety. From the moment I woke up, I had anxiety to the point where I would get physically sick. I would gag. I would throw up. That went on for literally 2 whole months, where I would uncontrollably gag. Sorry for the details, but from how intense my anxiety was. And when I experience severe anxiety, I feel a mass pit on the left side of my abdomen. It's always my left side. It's always in the same spot. And I fully believe that this is where my trauma and unprocessed emotions have manifested physically. I would wake up every morning feeling this mass on my side, feeling so sick, so uncomfortable in my own skin. There were times where I would force myself to paint, go on walks, but I pretty much wasn't functional. It literally felt painful and miserable to exist. It's something I wouldn't wish upon anyone. Severe depression is absolute hell. It was literally the worst time in my entire life. By January 2021, it became clear that the amount of medication I was on was absolutely ridiculous and absurd. I was taking 8 different medications a day. Yeah, 8 medications a day. My mom was wise enough to realize that it was an ungodly amount of medication, and that although I do have a history of anxiety, depression, and ADHD, the amount of meds I was on was just not adding up. So my parents and I came to the conclusion that the meds weren't helping me. If anything, it was making it worse. Because I was on so much medication, we couldn't tell where my symptoms were coming from. We didn't know if it was truly coming from me or if it was side effects from the medication. So in January, I withdrew from all my medications. All 8 of them I stopped taking in about 2 weeks, or even less. I think it was like a week and a half. Now, I would not recommend doing this. It's actually really dangerous to withdraw from pharmaceutical medications alone without a psychiatrist or doctor helping you. So do not just stop taking your medication like I did. I ended up going off of all my meds, and I went through withdrawal from the anti-anxiety medication and the SSRIs and everything. I remember one night I got really sick and had a fever of like 102. I was sweating, I was restless, I felt super ill, and it was really, really unpleasant. Even though I would never encourage anyone from quitting their medications cold turkey because it could be indeed physically dangerous, this ended up having to be necessary because you can't be on any pharmaceutical medication with a lot of psychedelic treatments, especially ayahuasca. Long story short, I got off all my medications, luckily with no adverse reactions or having any medical complications. Now, at this point, I began being actively suicidal. So again, don't go off all your medications at once. I have experienced suicidal ideation since I was about 15, 16, but this is where my passive suicidal thoughts went into active suicidality. It was very clear that I was in immense psychological distress, and I ended up spontaneously being able to do clinical ketamine treatments. I ended up doing 5 ketamine treatments once a week, but that experience was very disappointing. I've heard amazing things about ketamine for the treatment of depression for other people, but for me, it definitely didn't give me the results I was looking for. I definitely think going cold turkey off of my medications added to the fact that possibly the ketamine wasn't very helpful for me, and also definitely added to my suicidal thoughts. So again, I do not recommend just going off your medication. Just don't do it without a professional. Now, I can make a whole other video about the ketamine treatments. If you're interested in my experience doing ketamine treatments for my depression, I could go into more detail. Just leave a comment below. Now, it was February and the depression was not easing up. I didn't see an end in sight for when it would or if it ever would. And if you've ever dealt with depression, you know depression has a very persuasive way of making you feel like you're never going to get better. You don't feel any end in sight, which makes the illness so horrible and scary. So again, I was experiencing active suicidality. I wouldn't recommend listening to this if you're struggling with your mental health, but I am going to say that I remember specifically thinking, if this doesn't end soon, I will make it end soon. So I did start to think about how I would want to end my life. I had 2 ideas in mind, which for obvious reasons I'm not going to say on YouTube. It was really bad. It was really bad. And my mom obviously knew how bad it was. I never told her explicitly I was having suicidal thoughts, but she just knew. I think she just got the sense, all mothers know. They just know things. So one day I woke up and she called me. She was in Costa Rica at the time, and she said, "You're going to do ayahuasca. You're going to go to Rythmia Life Advancement Center." And I was pretty stunned. I was in such a bad headspace that I just couldn't really wrap my head around me flying to Costa Rica with the intention of drinking ayahuasca And I was hesitant, I'm not going to lie. And the thought of it really scared me. But my mom and I had a very serious talk, and she pretty much was like, nothing has really helped. The therapy isn't helping. The medications I was on weren't helping. The ketamine barely helped. So we really came to the conclusion that I wasn't left with many options, and I was getting increasingly more desperate. I felt like ayahuasca was the next step in trying to fight against the depression I was experiencing, that I really had no choice. It truly felt to me that my options were suicide or to drink ayahuasca and try to let it help me. So a few days later, I found myself on a plane back to Costa Rica, preparing for my first ayahuasca ceremonies at Rythmia Life Advancement Center, the only medically licensed facility in the world that can serve ayahuasca. And going off the medication ended up working out, because you can't be on any SSRIs to participate in doing ayahuasca. So the timing of it all worked out actually in the end. I plan to do a whole other video talking about my experience at Rythmia Life Advancement Center, my own personal experience, as well as what I think of Rythmia as a whole. While I did have a good experience there after becoming a part of the plant medicine community here for a year and a half in Guanacaste, Costa Rica, my view on Rythmia has definitely changed. But Rythmia needs to be a whole other video, because that week-long experience is just an entirely different story within itself. I will say though that going to Rythmia was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. It was not easy, but I'm really glad I got to experience it, and it introduced me to the plant medicine world and community, where I have experienced significant healing from ayahuasca, bufo, and shrooms. So without that experience, I honestly have no idea what would have happened to me or where I would be right now. I do believe ayahuasca needs to be a calling. I've met a very few amount of people who have done ayahuasca for the heck of it. Most people I meet on this journey have struggled with significant and severe physical or mental health issues. It's not something I would recommend for everyone. It's not for everyone. But if you feel the call and you have a very clear understanding of why you're choosing to do plant medicine in the first place, then it can be extremely beneficial. I could confidently say with plant medicine paired with therapy, I've made much bigger, more satisfying strides with my mental health in my entire life. I will be doing a video on how to know if plant medicine is calling you, so look out for that. And if you want to hear more about holistic mental health and psychedelics, and more about my personal journey navigating psychedelics, then I'd love for you to subscribe.